We know how to get around a scene, we know how to bring in some content. Now let's have a look at how we can illuminate that content in our 3D world so that we can start rendering out handsome pictures in the next step. Lighting is one of those topics that is extremely difficult and sometimes frustrating to newcomers as well as seasoned veterans alike. And that is only because there's so many components to the puzzle. There's lighting principles, there's lighting theories, then there's the tools that you need to make those work inside DAZ Studio or in fact other 3D applications. And then there's the vision that you have and how to marry that all up. And there's a few pitfalls in there. I thought before we look at the exact tools that we have available in DAZ Studio, let's have a look at a little bit of prep work and setup work. It's just something that we need to be aware of before we delve in. And that is a topic called the headlamp. If you've heard of it, then you know what it is. If you haven't heard of it, let me introduce you to it. So I have a sphere here. I'm looking at the filament viewport here, and it works exactly the same as in Iray. So I'm just going to show you how this pertains to filament because it'll be the same in Iray. So I have a sphere. It's shiny. I've given it a blue color, and we're looking at it with the default HDRI that is in there, which we'll learn about more in the next step. But if you ever wanted to know where that is, it's under Render Settings in the Environments tab. There's something here in the Environments map that is something that currently illuminates my scene. If this option isn't there under Render Settings, then switch your viewport over to Iray quickly and then back, or you can create an environment options node, and then this option is going to be available here. But just for now, this is where that light currently comes from. And here in the environment intensity, I can go and make an adjustment to it. And if I turn this from its default 1 to 0, then you'll notice that my sphere is black. And that's kind of what I'm expecting because there's no light in there, so nothing should be illuminated, which is correct. Now, by default, however, DAZ Studio employs this concept of a headlamp, and that is something that you can compare to a flashlight on top of a digital camera or on top of a film camera. Often roving news reporters on their video camera, they have a hot light that shines directly just above the lens. It shines into people's faces, and that is so that when you point the camera and the room is dark, this headlamp is supposed to illuminate where you're looking so that you have nicer light effects. Like if I wouldn't have this contraption here, which acts like a headlamp, then I would look like this, and that's not good. I mean, I'm like this mysterious voice from the dark, and that's not good. So I have a headlamp for that reason, and it's the most economic way to get light in a confined small space without any additional setup. And that's exactly how DAZ Studio thinks about this. If you have no lights, at least we're going to give you a headlamp. And it made more sense when we had the 3D light render engine, because that didn't come with the default HDRI that would globally illuminate everything. It didn't have that concept. So that's why it's still there. The default is that it's actually on, and that's on the Render Settings tab. If we head over to General and open this up, there's this MISC section here, and there's this section here that's called Auto Headlamp. I've set it to never and then saved it as part of my default scene. But just in case you're encountering this problem, watch what happens if I set that to its default when no scene lights. Then I'll go and wait a second, and then all of a sudden I can see my sphere, and I can also see the reflection of the headlight right here. So that is what the headlight does, or the headlamp does. If I go walk around, no matter where I'm looking at my object from, there's always going to be a light source shining at it. And of course, when we go and set up our own lights, this is going to interfere with that. So I recommend that you actually disable this feature because we no longer need it. Should it be enabled? You might have already done it, you might not have. Render Settings, General, MISC, and then up here, switch this from when no scene lights to never. And then that's really all we need to do in order to get predictable lighting in DAZ Studio. Just a related feature, and there's always another related feature, isn't there? If I had gone ahead and created myself a camera, I'm going to use the same one as my viewport, so copy active view, transform here. So now I have my perspective view and I have my camera. Maybe I'll go and look at both of these things side by side. Like we've learned, maybe side by side is good. This one's going to be the perspective view. This one's going to be the camera. So I can see that. Oh, and also this needs to be also filament so that we're seeing, that we're not comparing apples with pears here. So we're seeing exactly the same thing, once through the perspective view, once through my camera. The camera itself, when I have that selected, under parameters, also has an option called Headlamp right here. And that is by default set to auto, and there's nothing really that we can do to override it. Auto means use whatever is set in the render settings, but you can also override this and switch it to on or to off. So just something to be aware of. If I switch this to on now on the camera, then I'll see that my camera's viewport is illuminated, whereas the perspective view is not. That's one of those things. You've got to be aware of these intricacies so that, you know, you don't fall into the traps there. And it'll follow along when I go and change the setting on my render settings tab. So if I go back and change this from never to when no scene lights, it takes a second, and then both of these now enable because, you know, we don't have scene lights and we're supposed to use it when we don't have scene lights. The camera already has its, but now the perspective view also has its headlamp. Let's go back over to parameters with the camera selected. I'll switch the headlamp mode from on to auto, and nothing changes because auto means the camera follows whatever set in the render settings. I can now go override this and switch this to off, but be aware if you look through your camera, headlamp is off, switch back to your perspective view and headlamp is on again. To make things a little bit more confusing, I'll just leave this on off for now and go back to my render settings tab just to show you what this actually means. When no scene lights, which is the only other option other than never that we had. When no scene lights means if we have a HDRI, that's not classed as a scene light. That's classed as global illumination. A scene light is something that we can bring in manually, like under create and then say a point light or spotlight or distant light. Those are those dedicated lights. So watch what happens in my perspective view if I bring in a point light with this setting when no scene lights on the headlamp. If I bring one in and say, yeah, fine, default position is okay, then the auto headlamp is disabled. So now I can use my point lights and move it around and hopefully create a little bit of illumination with that. And you can see that the top of my sphere is being illuminated there just about. It's not very strong, so we don't really see all that much. We can just about see the reflection here, but you'll notice that when I have a scene light in there, this setting on the render settings means when no scene lights means the headlamp will be switched off if a scene light is present. Does that make sense so far? Because if I remove the point light, then my auto headlamp comes back. I guess we can all agree, a nice feature in principle with great intentions, but it really gets in the way when we try and set up our own lights. And it definitely gets in the way when you're getting started with lights. So I thought I'm going to get this out of the way so that you know this is what the headlamp feature is all about. And that is why I recommend you head over to render settings right away. Head over to general under the MISC section and switch this to never. And leave it there. Save this as a default scene and then bring that in like we discussed under edit, preferences, scene and startup. Save that scene and just make sure it's selected both here as well as there. I've done it and my headlamp never gets in my way again. Or alternatively, if you don't want to work with the default scene, just be aware of this feature and then go and disable it before you start working on a scene. That's really all I wanted to say about the headlamp. Now let's go and delve into the wonderful world of HDRIs and global illumination in the next video.